Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walks up to Harlem's most famous nightclub on a cold February night in 1935. He's wearing a tailored suit. He's got cash in his pocket. He's one of the most feared men in Harlem. But the white doorman at the Cotton Club slams the door in his face. Not because he's a gangster. Not because he can't pay. Because of his skin. Most men would have pulled a gun. Most men would have burned the place down. But Bumpy Johnson walked away without saying a word. 3 months later, that same club was begging black customers to come inside. No violence, no protests, no police involved. So what did Bumpy do that terrified them more than bullets ever could? To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Harlem in 1935. It was the most contradictory 20 blocks in America. By day, it was broken families of 8 crammed into 2-room apartments with no heat unemployment at 50% bread lines stretching around corners. The Great Depression had hit Black America twice as hard as white America, and Harlem was drowning. But by night, Harlem was the center of the universe. The Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, Small's Paradise, the Apollo Theater. These weren't just nightclubs, they were cultural engines that powered American music, American dance, American style. Duke Ellington's orchestra played at the Cotton Club 6 nights a week. Cab Calloway's energy lit up the stage like electricity. Lena Horne sang there. Bill Bojangles Robinson danced there. The best black talent in the world performed in Harlem. But here's the catch: black people couldn't sit in the audience. The Cotton Club, located at 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, right in the heart of Harlem, had a strict printed enforced policy: whites only. You could be Duke Ellington's brother, and you still couldn't buy a ticket to watch him play. You could live 3 blocks away, and you'd be turned away at the door. Meanwhile, white tourists from downtown Manhattan, from New Jersey, from as far as Boston, they lined up every night, paid top dollar, and got front-row seats to black genius. The Cotton Club didn't just allow this, it celebrated it. The decor was designed to look like a southern plantation. The waiters wore uniforms meant to evoke enslaved servants. The club's advertisements promised white patrons an exotic experience, a chance to watch primitive black performers in a safe, controlled environment. It was cultural extraction at an industrial scale. Harlem created the value. White-owned businesses captured the profit. And the people who lived in Harlem, the ones who made the music, who created the dances, who gave the neighborhood its soul, were locked out of their own culture's biggest stage. Everyone knew it. Everyone hated it. But what could they do? The Cotton Club was owned by Oni Madden, a white gangster with deep connections to Tammany Hall, the NYPD, and the Italian Mafia. He didn't need Harlem's approval. He had the law on his side. Segregation wasn't just legal in 1935, it was normal. But Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't interested in what was normal. At 30 years old, Bumpy was already a legend in Harlem. Not the loud kind of legend. He didn't brag, didn't showboat, didn't start fights in the street. Bumpy was the opposite. Calm, controlled, precise. He stood 5'9", always dressed in tailored 3-piece suits, fedora cocked just so shoes polished to a mirror shine. He didn't need to raise his voice. When Bumpy Johnson walked into a room, the temperature changed. People straightened up. Conversations paused. By 1935, Bumpy was the chief enforcer for Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen, the woman who controlled Harlem's underground lottery. The numbers racket was the economic lifeblood of the neighborhood. Thousands of families bet nickels and dimes every day, hoping to hit the winning number and escape poverty for a week, a month, a year. Stephanie St. Clair ran the operation with an iron fist, and Bumpy was her right hand. He wasn't just muscle. Bumpy was smart, strategically smart, the kind of smart that saw 3 moves ahead. He understood that real power wasn't about who could throw the hardest punch. It was about who controlled the system. And on that cold February night in 1935, Bumpy decided to test the system, not with violence, not with threats, just with his presence. He walked out of his apartment on 139th Street, adjusted his tie in the mirror, slipped on his overcoat, and headed north toward 142nd. He wasn't going to the Cotton Club because he loved Duke Ellington, though he did. He wasn't going because he wanted a drink. He could get a drink anywhere in Harlem. He was going because dignity shouldn't require permission, and because a door in his own neighborhood had been closed to him for too long. As Bumpy approached the Cotton Club, the street was already crowded. White couples in furs and tuxedos stepped out of taxis, laughing, smoking, handing their coats to attendants. A neon sign blinked above the entrance. Cotton Club, Harlem's hottest spot. Bumpy stopped on the sidewalk just for a moment and looked up at that sign. Harlem's hottest spot, built on Harlem's talent, filled with Harlem's music, profiting from Harlem's culture. But Harlem's people, not welcome. He took a breath, straightened his fedora, and walked toward the front door, the door reserved for paying customers, the door he had never been allowed to use. He wasn't carrying a gun. He wasn't bringing backup. Just a well-dressed man with money in his pocket walking up to a velvet rope in his own neighborhood. The doorman saw him coming from 20 feet away. The doorman's name was Eddie Sullivan, mid-40s, thick neckhands like catcher's mitts. He'd worked the Cotton Club door for 6 years, and his job was simple smile at the right people, stop the wrong people. Eddie wasn't cruel. He didn't spit slurs or shove anyone. He just enforced the rules. And the rules were clear: no black patrons. As Bumpy approached, Eddie stepped forward, blocking the entrance with his body. His face was neutral professional. He'd done this 100 times before. Evening. Eddie set his tone flat. Bumpy stopped 3 feet from the velvet rope. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked Eddie in the eye. "I'd like a table for 2. Bumpy said, his voice calm, measured. Eddie shook his head. "Club's full tonight." It was the standard line, the polite lie that every doorman used when they didn't want to say the truth out loud. Bumpy glanced past Eddie into the lobby. White couples were mingling, laughing, cocktails in hand. The club wasn't full. "I can wait," Bumpy said. Eddie's jaw tightened. "Look, pal, I don't make the rules. This is a private establishment." "Private." Bumpy's voice didn't rise, but something in his tone sharpened. "You take money from anyone who walks up long as they're the right color. That's not private. That's segregation." A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, other Harlemites, some on their way home from work, others just standing around watching the confrontation unfold. They knew how this would end. They'd all been turned away from doors before. A woman in her 50s, her coat threadbare, shook her head. "Don't waste your breath, baby. They don't want us in there." An older man leaning on a cane muttered, "Been that way since the place opened. Ain't never gonna change." But Bumpy wasn't trying to change Eddie Sullivan's mind. He was making a different point. He reached into his coat pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a billfold thick with cash, 20s and 50s folded neatly. He held it up just enough for Eddie to see. "I've got money," Bumpy said quietly. Eddie's face flushed. "I don't care if you've got $1 million. The answer's no." "Why?" The question hung in the air. Eddie looked uncomfortable now, not afraid, but aware that people were watching, that this wasn't just another routine rejection. He lowered his voice, as if saying it quieter would make it less brutal. "You know why?" Bumpy nodded once, slowly. He did know why. Not because he was a criminal. Half the white men inside the Cotton Club were criminals, mobsters, bootleggers, men with blood on their hands. Not because he couldn't afford it. Bumpy had more money in his pocket than most of the patrons inside. But because his skin was the wrong color. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown. 20 people, now maybe more. Some looked angry, fists clenched, jaws tight. Others looked resigned, like they'd seen this movie too many times to expect a different ending. One young man, no older than 20, stepped forward. "Man, forget this place. Let's go to Smalls. They let us in." But Bumpy didn't move. He just stood there looking at Eddie Sullivan, then at the Cotton Club's glowing sign, then back at the crowd. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see what the great Bumpy Johnson would do. Would he fight? Would he shout? Would he force his way in? For a long moment, Bumpy said nothing. Then he folded his billfold, slipped it back into his pocket, and turned around. No argument, no threats, no broken glass. Just a man in a tailored suit, walking away from a door that had been slammed in his face. The crowd parted as he passed some looking ashamed, not of Bumpy, but of the world that made moments like this routine. A woman touched his arm gently. "You're better than them, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy didn't respond. He just kept walking, his face unreadable, his pace steady. But inside his mind was moving at a different speed, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't thinking about tonight. He wasn't thinking about Eddie Sullivan, or Oni Madden, or the Cotton Club's stupid velvet rope. He was thinking about power. Real power. The kind that didn't shout. The kind that didn't need a gun. As he walked south on Lenox Avenue, passing the Apollo Theater, the Savoy Ballroom, the rows of brownstones where his people lived and worked, and created the culture that white America consumed without credit, Bumpy began to see Harlem differently, not as a victim, but as a sleeping giant. The Cotton Club needed Harlem. It needed Duke Ellington's band to pack the house. It needed Cab Calloway's energy to keep the white tourists coming back. It needed the black waiters, the black cooks, the black dishwashers, the black janitors. It needed the laundry service on 145th Street to wash the tablecloths. It needed the icemen to deliver ice for the cocktails. It needed the musicians' union to approve the schedules. The Cotton Club had built its empire on Harlem's labor, and it never occurred to Oni Madden that Harlem could simply stop cooperating. Bumpy turned the corner onto 135th Street and stopped in front of a small diner. Through the window, he could see Samuel, the owner, wiping down the counter. Bumpy pushed open the door. The bell jingled. Samuel looked up, saw Bumpy's face, and poured a cup of coffee without asking. He slid it across the counter. "Heard you tried the Cotton Club tonight," Samuel said quietly. Word traveled fast in Harlem. Faster than cars. Faster than phones. Bumpy nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "They turned me away." Samuel shook his head, but he didn't look surprised. "That's how it is. Always has been." "Maybe," Bumpy said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. "But it doesn't have to stay that way. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You planning to burn the place down?" Bumpy smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just cold calculation. Nothing that loud, because Bumpy understood something that most people did in violence would give the Cotton Club's owners exactly what they wanted. An excuse to call the cops, an excuse to paint Harlem as dangerous, an excuse to justify even harsher segregation. But economic pressure that was invisible, legal, unstoppable, and it didn't require a single bullet. Bumpy finished his coffee, set the mug down, and stood up. He dropped $1 on the counter, twice what the coffee cost. "Sam," Bumpy said, "how many people you know who work for the Cotton Club?" Samuel thought for a moment. "Directly, maybe a dozen. Dishwashers, waiters, coat check girls." "And how many people work for the businesses that supply the Cotton Club laundry ice liquor food?" Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Bumpy adjusted his fedora, his expression unreadable. "Just curious." He walked out into the night, the cold February air biting at his face. But Bumpy Johnson didn't feel the cold. He felt something else, clarity, because he'd just figured out how to make the Cotton Club's doors swing open without ever touching them. Bumpy didn't go home that night. Instead, he walked. Not aimlessly. Bumpy Johnson never did anything aimlessly, but with the focused precision of a man conducting reconnaissance. He moved through Harlem like a general surveying a battlefield, except the battlefield wasn't made of trenches and barbed wire. It was made of commerce, labor, dependencies. He started at the corner of 142nd and Lenox, right outside the Cotton Club's back entrance. It was nearly midnight now, and the club's kitchen was in full swing. Through the alley, Bumpy could see black men in stained aprons, hauling crates, champagne, whiskey, gin. A delivery truck idled at the loading dock, its engine rumbling. Bumpy recognized the driver, a man named Thomas, mid-30s, who'd grown up 3 blocks from where Bumpy's sister lived. Thomas was lifting a crate of French wine, the kind that cost more per bottle than he made in a week. Bumpy stepped into the alley's shadows and watched. Thomas and 2 other workers, both black, both exhausted, unloaded case after case. No one thanked them. No one even looked at them. They were invisible labor, the machinery that kept the Cotton Club's fantasy running. And that's when the first piece clicked into place. The Cotton Club couldn't function without deliveries. They served 500 drinks a night, maybe more, on weekends. That meant constant resupply. And every single supplier that serviced the Cotton Club, they all came through Harlem. Bumpy made a mental note. Talk to the liquor distributors. He walked south on Lenox past shuttered storefronts and dimly lit windows. At 140th Street, he stopped outside a laundromat, Pearl's Linens, owned by a woman named Pearl Washington. The lights were still on inside, and through the window, Bumpy could see Pearl and her 2 daughters folding white tablecloths. Mountains of them. Bumpy knew Pearl. Everyone in Harlem knew Pearl. She'd been washing linens for the Cotton Club, the Savoy, and half a dozen other nightclubs for 15 years. She worked 16-hour days, 6 days a week, and her prices were the lowest in the city. Pearl needed the business. The clubs knew it. They squeezed her margins until there was almost nothing left. Bumpy watched her fold another tablecloth, crisp, perfect white as snow. That tablecloth would be on a table at the Cotton Club tomorrow night, under the champagne glasses of white tourists who'd never know Pearl's name. He made another note, talk to Pearl. At 135th Street he passed the Musicians' Union Hall. The lights were off, but Bumpy knew what happened inside those walls. Every week, Duke Ellington's band members came here to pick up their paychecks, half of what white musicians made for the same work. The union had tried to fight for better pay, but the club owners had them over a barrel. If you didn't play by their rules, you didn't play at all. And in 1935, during the Depression, musicians couldn't afford to turn down work. But what if they didn't turn it down? What if they just showed up late? Bumpy smiled in the darkness. Not a warm smile, a predator's smile. Talk to the union leader. He kept walking, tracing the invisible network that fed the Cotton Club's empire. He walked past the ice company on 133rd, owned by a black man named Moses, who delivered 300 pounds of ice to the club every single day. He walked past the butcher shop that supplied the steaks, past the flower vendor who provided the centerpieces, past the shoeshine stand where the club's white doormen got their shoes polished before their shifts. Every single step of the Cotton Club's supply chain ran through Harlem, and every single link in that chain was controlled by black hands. The Cotton Club didn't just extract culture from Harlem. It extracted labor goods services, billions of tiny transactions that kept the machine running smoothly. And the genius of it, the sick brilliance, was that Harlem had been conditioned to see this extraction as inevitable. That's just how it is. The white folks own the clubs. We just work there. But Bumpy saw something different. He saw leverage. By 2 a.m., Bumpy had walked nearly 4 miles. His feet ached. His coat was damp from the February cold. But his mind was sharp electric, alive with possibility. He stopped at an all-night diner on 130th Street and ordered coffee. The waitress, a tired woman in her 50s named Dorothy, poured it without a word. The diner was nearly empty. Just Bumpy, a pair of dock workers arguing over a baseball game, and an old man asleep in a corner booth. Bumpy sat by the window and pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket. He'd started carrying it a few years ago, a habit he'd picked up from Madame St. Clair, who believed that power came from information, not intimidation. He flipped it open and began writing names. Thomas, liquor delivery, Pearl Washington, Laundry Moses, Ice Supply, Franklin George, Musicians Union Samuel, diner owner connected to waitstaff network, Reverend Clayton, church connections, dishwashers, janitors. The list grew. 20 names, 30, 40. Each name represented a node in the network, a pressure point, a person who, if they simply stopped caring just a little bit, could make the Cotton Club's operation 5% less efficient. And if you made 40 different things 5% less efficient, the whole system collapsed. Bumpy stared at the list, his coffee growing cold. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't even protest. It was something quieter. Something that couldn't be pointed to in a courtroom. It was friction. The kind of friction that happens when people stop going the extra mile. When deliveries arrive on time, technically, but the crates are stacked poorly, so it takes twice as long to unload them. When the laundry comes back, clean technically, but not pressed quite as sharply, so the staff has to iron everything again. When the band shows up technically on time, but takes longer breaks so the show starts 15 minutes late. Nothing illegal. Nothing you could fire someone for. Just the natural result of people who'd been disrespected for years finally deciding they didn't owe their oppressors perfection. Dorothy refilled Bumpy's coffee. "You okay, baby? You look like you're planning something." Bumpy looked up at her and smiled genuinely this time. Just thinking about doors, Dorothy. Doors, yeah. How some of them only open one way, until you change the hinges. Dorothy frowned, confused, but Bumpy didn't explain. He left $2 on the table, triple what the coffee cost, and walked out into the pre-dawn cold. The streets were quieter now. Harlem was asleep, or close to it. But Bumpy's mind was racing, because he'd realized something crucial violence would have made him feel better. Burning down the Cotton Club, punching Eddie Sullivan, making a scene, all of that would have been emotionally satisfying. But it wouldn't have changed anything. The club would have rebuilt. The police would have cracked down. Harlem would have been painted as dangerous, and segregation would have gotten worse, not better. But this was different. This was power without spectacle. Strategy without noise. Bumpy thought back to something Madame St. Clair had told him years ago when he was younger, angrier, more reckless. Power isn't about who can scream the loudest, Bumpy. It's about who can make the other side beg without ever raising your voice. At the time, he hadn't fully understood, but now, walking through the sleeping streets of Harlem, he got it. The Cotton Club needed Harlem more than Harlem needed the Cotton Club. If every nightclub in Harlem disappeared tomorrow, the neighborhood would survive. People would still eat, sleep work, love create. But if Harlem's labor disappeared, the clubs would crumble within weeks. That was the calculation. That was the leverage. And the beautiful thing, the devastating thing, was that Oni Madden and his partners had no idea. They thought they held all the cards because they owned the buildings, held the liquor licenses, had the police in their pockets. But they'd made a fatal miscalculation. They'd built their empire on the assumption that black labor was infinite, replaceable, powerless. That there would always be another dishwasher, another delivery driver, another musician desperate enough to accept scraps. And maybe that had been true before. But Bumpy was about to organize that desperation into something else. Not rage, not rebellion, discipline. By the time the sun rose over Harlem on that cold February morning, Bumpy had a plan. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, and it wouldn't make headlines. But it would work. Because the Cotton Club had spent years teaching Harlem that it didn't matter, that black people were invisible, that their labor, their talent, their dignity was something white people could take without consequence. And Bumpy Johnson was about to teach them a different lesson. He stopped at the corner of 139th and Lenox, right outside his own apartment. He looked north toward the Cotton Club's neon sign, still glowing in the distance, even as dawn broke. Then he looked around at Harlem, at the brownstones, the storefronts, the streets where his people lived. This neighborhood had been beaten down, exploited, humiliated for decades, but it had never been powerless. It had just never been organized. Bumpy pulled out his notebook one more time and wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. 3 months, that's all I need. 3 months to make them understand what Harlem is worth. He closed the notebook, slipped it back into his coat, and walked upstairs to his apartment. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, he'd start having conversations. Quiet conversations, one person at a time. No speeches, no rallies, no declarations. Just questions. What would happen if the ice came late? What would happen if the laundry wasn't quite perfect? What would happen if the band took longer breaks? And the answer that would change everything, was simple. The Cotton Club would learn what it felt like to be disrespected. Not with fists, Not with fire, but with the quiet, relentless, unstoppable force of a community that had finally remembered its own power. The first conversation happened on a Tuesday morning, February 12th. Bumpy walked into Pearl's Linens at 7 a.m., just as Pearl was opening the shop. She looked tired. She always looked tired, but she smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Johnson, you need something pressed." "No, Pearl, I need 5 minutes of your time." Pearl glanced at the clock, then at the mountain of tablecloths waiting to be washed. The Cotton Club's delivery was due by 3 p.m. She couldn't afford to fall behind. But when Bumpy Johnson asked for 5 minutes, you gave him 5 minutes. She gestured to a wooden chair near the counter. Bumpy sat. Pearl stayed standing. Her arms crossed her face, guarded. "What's this about?" Bumpy didn't waste time. "How much does the Cotton Club pay you per load?" Pearl's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Just curious." She hesitated, then sighed. $12 for 60 tablecloths, 100 napkins, and 30 aprons. Picked up Monday, delivered Wednesday. Bumpy did the math in his head. 60 tablecloths, each used twice a night, once for dinner service, once for the late show. That meant Pearl was washing 120 uses worth of linens every week, plus napkins and aprons. $12. "And if the delivery's late," Bumpy asked, "they dock me $2. "But if you're late because the washing machine broke down, or you got sick, or the soap supplier didn't deliver on time," Pearl shrugged. "Doesn't matter. Late is late." Bumpy leaned back in his chair. What if the tablecloths came back? Not wrong exactly, just not perfect. A little wrinkled, a little damp. Pearl's expression hardened. "I'd lose the contract. They'd find someone else." "Would they?" Pearl blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Bumpy said slowly, "you're the only laundry service in Harlem that can handle their volume. You've got the biggest machines, the fastest turnaround. If they fired you, they'd have to go downtown. And downtown charges $20 for the same job. Plus delivery fees." Pearl stared at him. So what if your machine started running a little slower? What if the soap you use started leaving the linens a little stiff? What if you couldn't guarantee that 3 p.m. delivery anymore? Maybe it's 4 p.m. Maybe 5. Pearl's voice dropped to a whisper. They'd ruin me. Would they? Or would they realize that perfect service costs more than $12 a week? Pearl looked at the pile of tablecloths, then back at Bumpy. She was starting to understand. "You want me to mess up on purpose?" "No," Bumpy said. "I want you to stop being perfect for people who don't respect you. There's a difference." He stood up, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back. "Cotton Club turned me away last week. Wouldn't let me in. Not because I caused trouble. Not because I couldn't pay. Because of my skin." Pearl's jaw tightened. She knew that story. Everyone in Harlem knew that story by now. You ever been inside Pearl, the place you wash tablecloths for 6 days a week? Pearl shook her head. Didn't think so. Bumpy left without another word. Pearl stood there for a long time, staring at the tablecloths. Then she walked over to her washing machine and adjusted the temperature dial just a few degrees cooler than usual. Not enough to ruin anything. Just enough to make the linens come out slightly damp. The second conversation was with Moses the Iceman. February 14th. Bumpy found him at the ice plant on 133rd Street, loading 300-pound blocks onto his delivery truck. Moses was built like a bull, 6 foot 2 arms, like tree trunks, a man who'd been hauling ice since he was 15. "Moses, got a minute?" Moses looked up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Bumpy, what brings you down here? Your delivery route, you still servicing the Cotton Club. Every day, 300 pounds, sometimes more on weekends." Bumpy nodded. "And they pay you $8 a week, plus $1 tip if I'm early." Bumpy looked at the ice blocks, massive, freezing, back-breaking to move. What happens if the ice melts a little before it gets there? Moses frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if your truck breaks down on the way, or you get stuck in traffic, or you have to make another delivery first, and by the time you get to the Cotton Club, the blocks are 10% smaller?" Moses's eyes widened. They'd complain. Would they stop buying ice? Moses thought about it. No, they need ice. They serve 500 drinks a night. Exactly. So what if the ice just started arriving? Less perfect. Not ruined. Just melted around the edges. They'd still use it. They'd just need more of it. And you'd charge them for the extra blocks. Moses stared at Bumpy, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're a cold man, Bumpy Johnson." Bumpy smiled back. "Colder than your ice, Moses." The third conversation was with Franklin George, head of the Musicians Union. February 16th. Franklin was a trumpet player, had been for 20 years, and he'd watched Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and Count Basie build careers, while black musicians got paid half of what white musicians made. Bumpy met him at a bar on 134th Street. Franklin was nursing a whiskey, looking exhausted. "Franklin, heard the Cotton Club's still paying your guys $30 a week." Franklin nodded bitterly. $30 for 6 nights, 48 hours of work. White musicians get 60 for the same gig. And if the band showed up late? What happens? Franklin laughed darkly. They'd fine us, dock our pay. But would they cancel the show? Franklin paused. No, they can't. The crowd's already there. The tables are full. If there's no music, people walk out. So what if the band just took longer to set up longer breaks between sets? Tuning took an extra 10 minutes. Nothing they could fire you for. Just the normal friction of musicians who aren't being treated fairly. Franklin leaned back, his eyes sharp now. You're talking about slowing down the whole operation. I'm talking about getting paid what you're worth. And if that means the Cotton Club's schedule runs 15 minutes behind every night, that's their problem, not yours. Franklin drained his whiskey and set the glass down hard. When do we start? Tonight. By early March, Bumpy had spoken to 47 people. Laundry workers, ice deliverers, dishwashers, waiters, coat check girls, liquor suppliers, florists, butchers, janitors. He didn't ask anyone to quit. He didn't ask anyone to sabotage. He just asked them to stop being perfect. And in the second week of March, the Cotton Club started to notice. The ice deliveries came on time, technically, but the blocks were smaller. The manager complained, but Moses shrugged. Weather's warming up. Ice melts faster. The tablecloths came back clean, technically, but wrinkled. The club had to hire extra staff to iron them. Pearl apologized. New washing machine, still breaking it in. The band showed up on time technically, but they took longer breaks. The first set started 10 minutes late, then 15, then 20. Franklin blamed instrument trouble. The waiters moved slower. Not enough to get fired, but enough to frustrate customers. One waiter, a man named Jerome, explained it to a complaining patron. Sorry, sir, we're short-staffed tonight. They weren't short-staffed. Jerome just didn't feel like rushing for people who wouldn't let him sit in the audience. By mid-March, the Cotton Club's operating costs had increased by 20%. Oni Madden, the club's owner, sat in his office staring at the books, his face red with fury. "What the hell is going on?" he shouted at his manager, a nervous man named Vincent. Vincent shuffled through receipts. "I don't know, boss. Everything's just slower. The deliveries are late, the laundry's bad, the band's off schedule. Fire them, all of them, and replace them with who every laundry service in Harlem is backed up. Every ice company's having the same problems. The musicians' union won't send us new players unless we pay more." Madden slammed his fist on the desk. "This is sabotage. Maybe, but I can't prove it. Nobody's breaking the law. Nobody's refusing to work. They're just not as good as they used to be." And that was the genius of it. There was no crime to prosecute, no ringleader to arrest, no strike to break. Just a neighborhood that had quietly, collectively decided that the Cotton Club didn't deserve excellence anymore. By late April, exactly 10 weeks after Bumpy's conversation with Pearl, the club's costs had risen by 35%. Service quality had dropped. White patrons started complaining. The champagne wasn't cold enough. The tablecloths were wrinkled. The shows started late. Madden tried everything. He threatened suppliers. He offered bonuses for perfect deliveries. He tried to bring in white-owned businesses from downtown. But downtown vendors charged twice as much. And the few who agreed to work in Harlem found that their trucks had mysterious flat tires. Their deliveries got lost. Their invoices got misplaced. Harlem had closed ranks. And the Cotton Club, which had built its empire on exploiting black labor, suddenly discovered what happened when that labor stopped caring. On April 28th, 11 weeks after that February night, Madden called an emergency meeting with his accountants. "How much are we losing?" $12,000 a month. "If this continues, we'll be in the red by June." Madden's face went pale. $12,000. In 1935, during the Depression, that was a fortune. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't crack down. There was nothing to crack down on. He couldn't fire everyone. There was no one to replace them with. He was trapped. And then someone, his lawyer, a man named Bernard, said the words that changed everything. "Maybe it's time to reconsider the door policy." Madden's head snapped up. "What? The whites-only policy? Sir, I think this is Harlem's way of telling us it's not working anymore." Madden stared at him, his jaw clenched. The idea was unthinkable. Open the doors to black patrons. Let them sit in the same room as white customers. But the numbers didn't lie. The Cotton Club was bleeding money. And the only way to stop it was to give Harlem what it wanted. Respect. Madden closed his eyes. He thought about his reputation, his pride, his belief that segregation was the natural order of things. Then he thought about $12,000 a month. "Fine," he said quietly. "Change the policy. Effective immediately." 3 months. That's all it took. 3 months for Harlem to teach the Cotton Club that respect wasn't negotiable. It was inevitable. The announcement came on a Friday afternoon, May 17, 1935. No press conference, no apology, no acknowledgement that anything had ever been wrong. Just a small notice in the Amsterdam News, Harlem's black newspaper, buried on page 7. Cotton Club welcomes all patrons. Effective immediately. The article was 3 sentences long. It said the Cotton Club was expanding its customer base and that all well-dressed patrons with reservations would be admitted. That was it. No mention of the 15-year whites-only policy. No explanation for the sudden change. Just corporate language designed to make discrimination disappear into the past without anyone having to say the word sorry. But Harlem noticed. Word spread through the neighborhood like electricity through a wire. Barbershops, beauty salons, church steps, corner stores. Within hours, everyone knew. The Cotton Club opened its doors. Some people celebrated. Others were skeptical. And a few people who'd been turned away too many times to trust a 3-sentence announcement said they'd believe it when they saw it. Bumpy Johnson said nothing at all. He just waited. On Friday night, May 24th, 1935, exactly 3 months and 10 days after that February rejection, Bumpy Johnson walked up to the Cotton Club's front entrance for the second time. Same tailored suit, same fedora, same calm, unreadable expression. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a dozen Harlem residents, men and women, young and old, all dressed in their finest clothes. Pearl Washington, the laundry woman, wore a navy blue dress she'd been saving for her daughter's wedding. Moses the Iceman wore a suit so new the price tag was still tucked inside the jacket. Franklin George, the Union leader, wore his sharpest tuxedo, a white carnation in his lapel. They weren't there to cause trouble. They were there to verify. Eddie Sullivan, the doorman, stood at his usual post. When he saw Bumpy approaching, his face went pale. He looked like a man who'd just seen a ghost, or worse, a man who'd just realized his entire worldview was about to be proven wrong. Bumpy stopped 3 feet from the velvet rope, the same distance as last time. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown 50 people, maybe more. Some were Harlemites who'd heard the rumor and wanted to see if it was true. Others were white tourists confused, wondering why a black man in an expensive suit was standing at the front entrance instead of going around back. Eddie's hand hovered near the velvet rope. His face was tight, conflicted. He'd spent 6 years enforcing a rule that had just been erased with a 3-sentence memo. No one had told him how to feel about it. Finally, Eddie spoke, his voice hoarse. "How many in your party, sir?" The word "sir" hung in the air like a gunshot. Bumpy didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply said, 12. Eddie nodded slowly, then unhooked the velvet rope and stepped aside. Bumpy walked through. Pearl followed, then Moses, then Franklin. One by one, 12 black Harlemites walked through the Cotton Club's front door, the door that had been closed to them for 15 years. The lobby went silent. White patrons in furs and diamonds stared. The coat-check girl froze mid-reach. A waiter dropped a tray. The crash echoed like thunder. But Bumpy didn't stop. He walked straight to the maitre d', a thin white man with a pencil-thin mustache who looked like he was about to faint. "Table for 12, Bumpy said calmly. The maitre d' stammered. I'll need to check availability. You have 20 empty tables," Bumpy said, his voice flat. "I can see them from here." The maitre d' swallowed hard, then grabbed a stack of menus. "Right this way." He led them to a table near the stage. Not the best table, but not the worst either. A table in full view of the entire club. Bumpy sat down first, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Pearl sat beside him, her hands trembling slightly. Moses cracked his knuckles. Franklin stared at the stage where Duke Ellington's band was setting up, a look of quiet triumph on his face. Around the room, white patrons whispered, Some looked scandalized. Others looked curious. A few older couples, people who remembered when segregation wasn't codified into law, just looked tired, but no one left. The waiter who approached their table was a young black man named Jerome, the same Jerome who'd been moving slower for the past 3 months. He grinned when he saw Bumpy. "Good evening, Mr. Johnson. Can I start you with drinks?" Bumpy ordered whiskey. Pearl ordered wine. Moses ordered champagne, the most expensive bottle on the menu. And when the drinks arrived, Bumpy raised his glass and looked around the table at the people who'd helped make this moment possible. "To Harlem," he said quietly. "To Harlem," they echoed, and they drank. The next night, 20 more black patrons walked through the Cotton Club's doors. The night after that, 50. By the end of the week, the Cotton Club had more black customers than it had ever imagined possible. And the white tourists, most of them, didn't care. They'd come to hear Duke Ellington, and Duke sounded the same, whether the audience was segregated or not. A few white patrons complained. A few stopped coming. But they were replaced by new customers, black doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners who'd been waiting 15 years for this moment. The Cotton Club's revenue didn't drop. If anything, it increased. Because Harlem had money. It had always had money. It just hadn't been allowed to spend it. But the Cotton Club wasn't the only door that opened. Within 6 weeks, Small's Paradise quietly dropped its whites-only policy. Then the Savoy Ballroom. Then the Lenox Lounge. One by one, Harlem's nightclubs realized what the Cotton Club had learned the hard way: segregation was expensive. It required enforcement. It required turning away paying customers. It required an entire infrastructure of rules doorman policies, all designed to exclude people who wanted to give you money. And in the middle of the Great Depression, turning away, money was a luxury no business could afford. The change wasn't universal. There were still segregated spaces in Harlem, still neighborhoods where black people weren't welcome. But the most visible, most profitable, most culturally important venues they opened, not because white owners had a change of heart, but because Harlem had taught them a lesson in economics. Respect isn't a favor, it's a cost-benefit analysis, and once the cost of disrespect became higher, then the benefit the doors swung open on their own. 3 months after the Cotton Club opened its doors, Bumpy Johnson sat at a corner table sipping whiskey and watching Duke Ellington play Sophisticated Lady. The same doorman who'd turned him away now nodded politely as black couples walked through the entrance. The same maitre d' who'd stammered nervously now seated black patrons without hesitation. Pearl Washington sat 2 tables over, celebrating her daughter's engagement. Moses was at the bar, laughing with a group of icemen who'd all chipped in to buy a round of champagne. Franklin George stood near the stage, talking to Duke Ellington. During a break, both men smiling. Nothing had been destroyed. No buildings had burned. No one had gone to jail. Just pressure. Quiet, relentless, organized pressure. And a door that had been closed for 15 years had swung open not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Bumpy finished his drink and stood up. He adjusted his fedora, slipped on his coat, and walked toward the exit. As he passed the doorman, Eddie Sullivan, the 2 men's eyes met. Eddie looked like he wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an explanation. But Bumpy just nodded once and kept walking, because some things didn't need to be said. The door was open. That was enough. As Bumpy stepped out into the warm May night, He looked up at the Cotton Club's neon sign, still glowing, still promising, Harlem's hottest spot. But now, for the first time, Harlem was actually invited. Bumpy smiled a rare, genuine smile and walked south on Lenox Avenue. He'd proven something that night, something bigger than one Club One policy, one moment of humiliation. He'd proven that power didn't always come from violence or legislation or waiting for white people to change their minds. Sometimes power came from simply remembering what you controlled and refusing to give it away for free. Harlem had spent 15 years asking for respect, but on that February night in 1935, when Bumpy Johnson walked away from the Cotton Club's door, Harlem stopped asking and started taking. February 7th, 1935. A white doorman slammed a door in Bumpy Johnson's face, turned him away from the Cotton Club in his own neighborhood. Most men would have retaliated with violence. Burned the place down, made headlines. Bumpy walked away silent. 3 months later, May 24th, 1935, that same club opened its doors to black customers, not because of protests, not because of lawsuits, because Harlem made segregation too expensive to maintain. Bumpy Johnson organized laundry workers, ice deliverers, musicians, waiters, every link in the Cotton Club's supply chain. They didn't strike, they didn't sabotage, they just stopped being perfect. Late deliveries, wrinkled tablecloths, slower service, nothing illegal, nothing you could prove in court, just friction. Within 12 weeks, the Cotton Club was losing $12,000 a month, and when the owner finally caved and opened the doors, other clubs followed. Small's Paradise, the Savoy, the Lenox Lounge. Harlem had learned the lesson economic power, when organized, is unstoppable. But this wasn't the last time Bumpy Johnson would force New York to change its rules. Because while he was teaching Harlem the power of silent resistance, another war was brewing in those same streets. A war that wouldn't be won with late deliveries and cold champagne. A war where Dutch Schultz, the most violent white mobster in New York, tried to take Harlem's numbers racket by force. Where bodies dropped in the streets. Where Stephanie St. Clair fought back. And where Bumpy Johnson proved that when economics failed, he had other methods. Next time, the Harlem Numbers War. 40 men dead, and the night Bumpy became untouchable. If this story showed you a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that restructures systems from within, then you understand why Bumpy Johnson's name still echoes in Harlem today. Subscribe, because the Cotton Club was just the beginning, and the bloodiest chapter, that's next.